Welcome back. Now, as you know, if you've been following the last few installments of this vlog, we have been taking a trip backwards in time to discuss the different styles of decorating that have been popular here in the United States, and I think to a large extent throughout the world, but mostly here in the US. We went through the last 40 years last weekend. I know, amazing. 3 days, we covered 40 years. Um, we are going to cover approximately 20 years this weekend, because this weekend we are doing the 50s and 60s, and they were anything but bland. So stick around. We'll be right back. Okay, since we are going backwards, we're going to start with the 1960s. And I noticed a lot of the comments for last video, which was the 1970s, had said, Sue, you forgot about this, you forgot about that. No, sorry, did not forget. It's just that a lot of the things that people were associating with the 70s actually came out in the 1960s instead. The 1960s was a very interesting period in home decor because the 1960s, it's almost like it doesn't really have its own character. The early 1960s, up to about 1965, 1966, was more of a carryover of the 50s. And from 66 to 70 was more of a prelude into the 70s. There is no real 60s in terms of home decor, with the exception of the great psychedelic 60s. And that's something we're going to touch on in a little bit. But I have a laundry list here. Some things that either came out in the 60s or came into their own in the 60s. And we're going to talk about those individually. And let's start with wall-to-wall carpeting. Now, wall-to-wall carpeting was around in the 1950s, but it wasn't widespread. Wall-to-wall carpeting really came into its own in the 60s because it was a cheaper floor treatment than hardwood floors or tile floors, the other hard surface floorings, which were in fact very expensive. Now, today, that's not true because we have laminate flooring, which allows us to get a terrific look of hardwood. I have gone into places, this is how I know, I've gone into places and I've actually touched the flooring to see if it was laminate or real wood. Sometimes it can be very, very hard to tell. The advent of laminate flooring has made wood or wood look flooring less expensive than wall-to-wall carpeting, but wall-to-wall was simply the builder's cheaper alternative. And when we went into the 60s, that's when we started to see wall-to-wall carpeting everywhere, absolutely ubiquitous. Word of the day. Okay, we got one already. Ubiquitous is a Latin word, and it's a straight up borrowing from Latin. Ubiquitous simply means everywhere in Latin. The interesting thing about this word, because obviously we need something interesting or it can't be the word of the day, is that is a word that was introduced into the English language, that straight up borrowing, only in the mid-1800s. It's a sort of word you would think, oh, Shakespeare probably used it. Jane Austen probably used it. Nope. I mean, unless they were studying Latin or they were academics, they were not using it. So it's a relatively recent word. It's a great word because you can use, that's one of those wonderful words. It's a 50-cent word, but you can use it every day, impress the daylights out of your friends. You know, your mess is ubiquitous. Have fun with the kids with that one. So wall-to-wall carpeting came into its own in the 60s. It is going away. Thank God. Because wall, I, I, I have trouble wrapping my head around the concept of cloth on your floor that you're walking on with your shoes that is only cleaned maybe twice a year. And people are not troubled by this. And I look at wall-to-wall carpeting and say, I bet there are bugs in there. I bet there's dirt. I don't want to touch that. That's my own peculiarity. Formica. Now, Formica was around in the 1950s, but when you saw Formica, and it was used on all kinds of things, it was used on furniture, it was banded in chromed metal. Chrome itself, by the way, is not a metal. It's like a treatment that you put on metal to get that high mirrored finish that is supposed to replicate silver. It doesn't really. I mean, it's chrome. But do you remember those beautiful tables in the 1950s and early 60s? Those gorgeous Formica designs and big wide chrome bands. Same thing with kitchen counters from this era. Beautiful Formica countertops with these wide chrome bands, because in the 50s they didn't have the technology to do what they call now post-formed countertops, which is the Formica comes around a curved edge and goes right up into a curved backsplash. That came out in the 60s. Formica countertops were everywhere. We were like swimming in Formica through the 60s and through the 70s. By the late 70s, we had items like Corian and these faux stone countertops that were almost indestructible. The color went all the way through, because remember, with the Formica, if you had a seam, boy, you could see it a mile away. And if you put a little Formica band around the edge of your countertop, you could see that little bit of the underlayment, which was it's either some sort of pressed wood product. It's either very strong paper or very soft wood. You choose. So Formica everywhere. That was 1960s. Wood paneling. Oh dear. Yeah, it didn't even look like real wood. It was some sort of pressed cardboard-like stuff, and that was all over the place. Usually the wood was dark, and being in New England at the time, what I found incredibly ridiculous about it was you would see wood paneling in these homes, old homes, that had the fancy woodwork that had been painted for generation upon generation, and these big, wide mopboards along the floors and the wide woodwork, and then paneling next to it. That was just a nightmare. That is something that has passed away, but I'm sure it will come back. Wood paneling always seems to resurface every 20, 30 years. If it comes back, I hope it comes back as real wood, a beadboard, or there's some very nice, genuine wood paneling. Personally, I love the old oak linen fold panels that they've survived from the Middle Ages in places in Europe. It's just gorgeous, gorgeous paneling. That is not what we had. We had some sort of wood grain print embossed on something that wasn't wood, and you nailed it to the wall. Eek. Okay. Mirrors. Well, mirror tiles were 12 by 12 tiles, and that's for those of you who were fortunate enough to have missed this the first time around. They were not necessarily just mirror. If they were just mirror, they would have been a wall of mirror tiles, and you would say, okay, too much mirror. I don't want to see myself quite that much. Oh, no. They were smoky with little patterns of black and gray on it with gold veining, and that was really a thing in the late 60s. The reason why, of course, is the rest of the room being fuchsia and chartreuse was not enough. Let's double it with a lovely mirror. What were we thinking? Eek. Accent walls. An accent wall is when you have one wall that's a different color from the rest of your walls. Sometimes they were not just a different color, but a completely different texture, a faux stone wall. That was something that actually came out in the 50s, but it carried through to the 60s. These faux stone walls, sometimes it was a wood panel wall, so you could get all that mess into one unit. Or, your mirrored wall, it's like, geez, if you're going to go crazy, let's go all the way. And other times they were murals. Oh, look, a sunset on my wall. Ooh. What were we thinking? That was something that really came into its own in the late 60s and carried through to the 70s. By the 70s, you could get anything from a Hawaiian sunset to New Hampshire woods on your walls, and people paid money for this. I should think, you'd have to be paid to do that in your home. No, people went out of their way for that. Frightening. Let's see. Waterbeds. Okay. Here's the thing. Somebody got it into their head that having 300 or 400 gallons of water in a bed in your bedroom was a good thing. They leaked. They were enormously heavy, and only the best constructed houses could house these things on an upper story. Oh, and of course, if you had it on an upper story and you sprung a leak, there goes the dining room ceiling below you. And you would sort of clamber into the waterbed, which was rocking, and you get in there and it's like, you're supposed to sleep on this. No idea how anybody could do that. I spent 5 minutes in a waterbed once in my lifetime. I thought I was going to get sick and sort of clambered out again, which took me at least as long as it did. As I spent in there was at least 5 minutes just scrambling toward the edge, thinking, how am I supposed to get out of this? Oh, what a disaster. Again, what were we thinking? We were just mad. Water. Aquariums. Home aquariums, actually became a decorative feature in the 1960s. Now, this is a really, really high maintenance hobby for those of you who don't keep tropical fish. And huge, like walls of fish. Now, this is a wonderful hobby if this is something you want to do. I love looking at aquaria. I really, really do. But in your home, quick story about aquarium. I was at a party at the home of a woman. She was a coworker of my ex-husband's, and she's a lovely woman. She had a lovely home, and I was down in her basement rec room, and I happened to look at her fish. Oh, pretty fish. I come back 20 minutes later. There's this much less water in the fish tank. And I'm looking, it's like, I don't know what's going on here, but that water level seems to be dropping. An hour later, it's half full. The pump had apparently gotten clogged, backed up, and instead of pumping air into the tank, it was pumping water out. Well, this was a 50-gallon aquarium, and by then there was about 30 gallons of water on her floor. Whoa. Again, you really need to know what you're doing if you're going to keep something like that in your home. Maintaining an aquarium is not for the faint of heart, and maintaining an aquarium solely as a decorative item in your home because you saw it in a magazine is probably yeah, oh, that's right up there in terms of way too crazy. That was a big thing in the 60s. That went through to the 70s to a large extent. um, oh yeah, blinds. We don't have a problem these days with mini blinds. Most people have them. I have them. They block out light. It's a very good way to control the light that comes into your room. Well, in the 1940s and the 1950s, if you wanted blinds, you had Venetian blinds. They're wide slats of aluminum that if you touch them the wrong way, they would bend. And oh boy, they looked terrible when they got bent. And they had wide bands, wide canvas strips coming down to hold this whole assembly together. And by the 1960s, that was considered very passé. Venetian blinds were out, and they were replaced by window shades, roll-down window shades. Now, a window shade had a much cleaner look to it, but it didn't do the same as blinds in terms of light control. But that was a change in our window treatments, and it sounds like a minor change, but actually it was a pretty major change because you went from window shades in the early part of the century to the new modern Venetian blinds in the middle of the century, then back to our window shades again. And that stayed with us until the development of mini blinds, which are now usually made of plastic, which means if you bend them, they're not going to look terrible. They don't get distorted the way the old Venetian blinds did. And now they're thin slats, a cleaner line. They don't have those big canvas tapes running down them. So they are an improvement. But that was a change. And that was a change that had a fairly large impact on what we did with our windows. Because if you had blinds, you could, twist the blinds or pull the cord. I don't remember how the Venetian blinds work. Now they have a little bar you twist. Without that, to keep the neighborhood peeping Tom, we talked about him. I told you I think he's retired. To keep the neighborhood peeping Tom from seeing what's going on. Now you had to have lace curtains over your shade. So you had your shade and your lace curtains and your draperies. And this was the start of those heavily overdone windows we eventually saw 20 years later in the 80s. So you can see the way this sort of goes through. So those were the major changes in the 60s. And why don't we take a look at some 60s rooms? And these are just normal rooms. They're not used to illustrate anything except this is what the average American room in middle America, in suburban Des Moines, I guess, would have looked like in the 1960s. Okay, let's take a look at that. Okay, so as you can see, there was not a really big change between the average room in the 1960s and the average room in the 1970s. And when we get into the 1950s, you're going to get a chance to see there wasn't a real departure there either. There were a few things. When we get into that, we'll talk about it. But let's talk about the late 60s for a bit. When we think of the 60s, and we talk about 60s design, we start thinking of psychedelic Peter Max posters and la la la. In general, that did not exist in the average American household outside of the bedroom of the teenagers. This is not a design style that caught on with middle America. The psychedelic 60s was of, by, and for the younger generation. Remember, our watchwords were never trust anyone over 30. Well, guess what? The people who owned the houses were over 30. So this was not the way our parents were living. This was the province of the teenager's bedroom, of the college dorm room, of the hippie pad. But it's become very iconic. I was a teenager during this period, so I remember this very well. I have fond memories of, my yellow submarine poster and so on. So let's quickly take a look at the psychedelic 60s. And what I have in these pictures is not just, the psychedelic 60s, but some of the items of furniture you would have seen in the dorm room, the kids' bedroom, in the hippie pad. Just little bits and pieces of cobbled together stuff. So, psychedelic 60s, here we go. Yeah, interesting, huh? Um, as you can see from those pictures, that was not the way people lived. The room pictures, actually one of them was an actual room, um, but another was from a designer magazine telling people this was how they could live. And the people over 30, remember, these were people who they'd come through the Second World War. They were not having any of this nonsense. So it was something that was fun to look at, but it wasn't emblematic of how people really lived during that period. However, the items, the lava lamps and the psychedelic posters and those, like, I love that hand chair. That was just great. Those are things that we as thrifters and collectors and so on, those are things that we can find that have a really strong market these days. And by the way, eventually, I know, because you're probably all saying, Sue, we're supposed to be thrifting. How did we get off on this tangent? When we come back in our timeline, because we're going to go back and then we're going to come forward, these are the things we're going to be talking about, what we can pluck out of these different eras that we can find today, that we can either incorporate into our own decorating or flip for a profit. So things like lava lamps, oh my yes, a real genuine 1960s lava lamp, that's a find, that will sell. There is one other thing that was just, well, emblematic of the 60s. Pictures of little kids with huge eyes. Do you remember that? The little wide-eyed moppets? Well, there's a very interesting story behind those paintings. So I thought I'd take a minute and share this with you. Those paintings at the time were attributed to an artist named Walter Keane. And Walter Keane was a Among other things, a wild egomaniac. The man referred to himself in the third person. He would talk about, well, Walter Keane's art, honestly, like he was talking about somebody else, a little on the loopy side. Many years later, in the mid-1980s, his ex-wife sued him. And apparently, turns out that ex-wife Margaret Keane was the one who actually painted all of those pictures. He had been taking credit for her work. And at the time, that was like, oh my God, he's a plagiarist. And, people were just pretty shocked and horrified. The truth, by the way, is probably somewhere in between. Walter Keane was a well-trained artist. He had, prior to even meeting Margaret Keane when he was with his first wife, had a company that made French lesson kits. I know this is just French lesson kits for children that used hand puppets. And those hand puppets had these big eyes. Apparently the big-eyed Moppet thing was his idea. And as nearly as I can tell from piecing the story together in retrospect, it's quite likely that he taught his wife to paint these pictures and she did it. But when they met in court many years later, when I believe he sued her for libel for saying that she was the actual creator, the judge said, well, both of you can paint a picture. And Walter found that Walter was unable to do it. He had hurt his shoulder or something. And Margaret zapped out one of these things in less than an hour. So the court was satisfied that she was, in fact, the artist responsible. But to say that Walter had no hand in it, I think, would be carrying the story a little too far. But let's take a look at big-eyed Moppets. Those paintings, I remember when I was a child being very troubled by them, because those children, I would just look at them and say, they are so sad. I think they're hungry. And it was very disturbing to me as a little child, thinking about children who were that sad, that hungry. And their little cats and dogs had big sad eyes too. And I thought their cats and dogs must be hungry. And I found them extremely disturbing. They were everywhere. They were ubiquitous. And they were also schlock. Absolute garbage. Just, artistically speaking, this is trash. However, if you happen to come across an original Walter or Margaret Keane, pick it up. There's a market for them. The Keanes made millions on those paintings when they came out, and they are collector's items today, which is surprising because there were so many of them. The market was utterly flooded. But I think most of them went the way of all truly lousy art and ended up in the trash. But now they are collectible. So that was something else that was very 60s. And this is right through the 60s. It's not just late 60s. From the early 60s on, the Keanes were doing this from, I guess, the late 1950s. So if you find a big-eyed Moppet, you look for that signature, Walter Keane or Margaret Keane. The early ones from the 60s will have Walter's signature. The later ones will have Margaret's. And by the way, that's how you tell the difference. So we have those. My word. Okay. I have been negligent about sending out pens for the last week or so. And I have to apologize for that. My shipping materials are under a ton of rubble in the schoolhouse, so I had to order some new shipping supplies. They are in now, which means pen giveaways are back on. So you want pens, you let me know. Now, some of you may remember that one of the first of our pen giveaways went to a school teacher who was going to use the pens as a reward for the children in her class. She teaches a special ed class. And when the children did something good or, outstanding performance, they were going to get to write with the pen. Well, school's back in session. The pen is in use. So let's take a picture of a little one with a pen. Now, as you can see, I had to block out the child's face to preserve her privacy. And that is a pen from Lisa from DesertDragonworks. And I still have more pens. And when I have given away all the pens I have, I'm going right back to Lisa for more pens. So let's see about getting some homes for some of these pens. If you've already written, just please write again. I am going to do my very best to get to everyone. Just keep on writing in, and I will get the pens back on track. Okay, so that's it for today. Now, tomorrow, we're going to talk about the 1950s, because the 1950s, like I say, that flows into the early part of the 1960s, and we are going to start off talking about one of the biggest causes and effects at the same time of the change in the way we used our living room, and that's television. So have a great day, and I will see you guys tomorrow.